The house was shrouded in silence, a comforting stillness that Margaret often welcomed when her husband, David, was away on business trips. At 35, Margaret had grown accustomed to the solitude, even finding it somewhat soothing. Tonight, however, that sense of calm felt unsettling. Her stepson, Caleb, a 23-year-old college graduate, had returned home for the weekend. Though polite and courteous, his presence had begun to feel different lately, less like that of a visiting relative and more like that of a man. Margaret stirred in her sleep, the dryness in her throat waking her. She glanced at the clock, 12:47 a.m. The house was dark, save for the faint glow of the moon filtering through the curtains. She slipped out of bed, pulling on a light robe, and padded softly down the hallway toward the kitchen. As she passed by Caleb's room, she noticed his door was slightly ajar. A faint, flickering light spilled into the hallway. Margaret paused, debating whether she should check on him. Maybe he fell asleep with the TV on, she thought. She approached the door, intending to push it closed without waking him. But just as her hand reached out, she froze. A low voice, Caleb's voice, broke through the quiet. "I can't stop thinking about her," he murmured. His tone was soft, almost confessional. Margaret's breath caught. Is he on the phone? She wondered. The intimate tone of his words sent a ripple of unease through her. Curiosity got the better of her. She leaned in slightly, her fingers brushing the edge of the door. Peering through the small gap, she saw Caleb sitting on the edge of his bed. The dim light from his laptop illuminated his face, casting shadows across his sharp features. He wasn't on the phone. He was staring at the screen, his shoulders tense, his hands gripping his knees. Margaret's heart pounded in her chest as she realized the nature of what he was watching. Heat flushed her cheeks, and she took a step back, horrified and unsure of what to do. Suddenly, as if sensing her presence, Caleb glanced up. Their eyes met through the crack in the door. For a moment, neither of them moved. "Margaret?" His voice was low, startled, and tinged with something she couldn't quite place. She straightened abruptly, clutching her robe tightly around her. I heard something," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just wanted to make sure everything was okay." Caleb stood quickly, closing the laptop with a sharp snap. His face flushed a deep red, and he looked down, avoiding her gaze. "I'm fine," he muttered, his voice tight. "Sorry about that." Margaret's mind raced, and she couldn't bring herself to linger. "Good night," she said hastily, stepping back into the hallway. She turned and walked quickly toward her room, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts. By the time she reached her bed, her hands were trembling. She sat down, clutching the edge of the mattress as her heart continued to race. The image of Caleb's face, the surprise and embarrassment etched into his features, refused to leave her mind. "It's nothing," she told herself firmly. "Just an awkward moment. Forget it." But as she lay back down, staring at the ceiling, she knew that forgetting wouldn't be so easy. There had been something unspoken in Caleb's gaze when their eyes met. A flicker of something raw, something unsettling. And the worst part? For the briefest moment, she felt it too, a connection, a spark that terrified her. Margaret clutched her blanket tighter, willing the thoughts away. But the stillness of the night only amplified the tension she had felt in that brief exchange. For the first time in years, her heart raced for a reason she couldn't explain. And she knew, deep down, that something had shifted. Something that couldn't be undone. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen windows, casting warm streaks of light across the countertops. Margaret stood at the stove, absent-mindedly stirring a pot of oatmeal. The events of the previous night lingered in her mind like a haze she couldn't shake. No matter how hard she tried to dismiss the moment, Caleb's startled gaze and the weight of their brief exchange were burned into her memory. The sound of soft footsteps descending the stairs jolted her from her thoughts. She stiffened, her hand freezing mid-stir. Caleb appeared in the doorway, his hair slightly mussed and his movements cautious. He held a mug in his hand, his fingers wrapped tightly around it as though it were his shield. "Morning," he said, his voice low and tentative. Margaret turned to face him, forcing a polite smile. "Good morning." Breakfast will be ready soon. Caleb nodded, moving to sit at the kitchen table. The scrape of the chair against the floor was louder than usual in the otherwise quiet house. He avoided her gaze, staring down at the steam curling from his coffee. The silence between them was heavy, like an invisible wall neither dared to break. Margaret focused on the oatmeal, her hands trembling slightly as she scooped it into bowls. She placed one in front of Caleb and took the seat across from him, clutching her own bowl as if it could steady her. "How did you sleep?" she asked, her voice overly cheerful, trying to fill the awkward void. Caleb shrugged, his shoulders tense. "All right, I guess." "You?" Margaret hesitated, her spoon pausing halfway to her mouth. "Not great," she admitted, her tone softer now. "I was restless." Caleb glanced up then, his eyes flicking to hers for the first time since he entered the room. His gaze was cautious, searching, as though he was trying to gauge how much she remembered, or how much she'd bring up. "About last night," Margaret began, her voice faltering slightly. She wasn't sure why she felt the need to address it, but the weight of the unspoken moment hung between them, suffocating in its intensity. "You don't have to say anything," Caleb interrupted quickly, his cheeks flushing a faint pink. He stirred his coffee nervously. "It was nothing. I mean, it was stupid. I didn't think anyone would be awake." Margaret's heart ached at his obvious discomfort. She wanted to reassure him, to ease the tension, but she also didn't want to dwell on it any longer than necessary. "It's fine," she said, her voice gentle. "We've all had awkward moments. Let's just move on." Caleb nodded, though his posture remained stiff. "I just don't want you to think badly of me," he muttered, almost too quietly for her to hear. Margaret felt a pang of guilt. "I don't think badly of you," she said, leaning forward slightly, her tone firm and sincere. "Really, Caleb? It's okay." Their eyes met again, and for a moment, the tension in the room shifted. There was something vulnerable in his expression, something that made her chest tighten. She felt the words she had spoken settle in the air between them, anchoring them to a fragile truce. The kettle on the stove whistled, breaking the moment. Margaret stood quickly, grateful for the distraction. She busied herself pouring tea, keeping her back to Caleb as she tried to collect her thoughts. The heat of his gaze lingered, even as she moved to create distance between them. "Do you have any plans for today?" she asked, her voice a little too bright as she placed a mug in front of him. "Not really," Caleb replied after a pause. "I'll probably work on a few job applications. Maybe go for a run later." "That sounds good," Margaret said, forcing a smile. "You'll find something soon." "I'm sure of it." Caleb gave her a small nod, but his expression didn't change. He pushed his chair back, taking his mug with him as he stood. "Thanks for breakfast," he said, avoiding her gaze as he headed toward the door. "You're welcome," Margaret murmured, watching as he disappeared down the hallway. The kitchen felt oppressively empty after he left, the silence stretching out like an endless chasm. Margaret sipped her tea, her mind racing. She had hoped their brief conversation would ease the tension, but instead, it had only seemed to amplify it. She turned her attention to the chores waiting for her, laundry, dishes, dusting, but no matter how hard she tried to distract herself, her thoughts kept circling back to Caleb. She couldn't deny it any longer. Something had changed between them. And as much as she tried to convince herself otherwise, she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that this was only the beginning. The day dragged on with an agonizing slowness. Margaret threw herself into cleaning, rearranging the bookshelves in the living room, vacuuming the rugs, and scrubbing the kitchen counters until they gleamed. But no matter how much she worked, her mind was restless. Every quiet moment brought her thoughts back to Caleb, the awkwardness at breakfast, the tension in his gaze, and the unspoken weight that seemed to hang between them. It wasn't supposed to be like this. He was her stepson, and she was his father's wife. Whatever that fleeting spark was, it was wrong, and Margaret hated herself for not being able to dismiss it entirely. By mid-afternoon, Margaret decided to spend some time in the garden. The cool air and soft hum of birdsong usually helped clear her mind. She grabbed her gardening gloves and shears and stepped into the yard, determined to find some peace in trimming the overgrown hedges. She was so focused on her work that she didn't notice Caleb stepping outside until he spoke. "Need some help?" Margaret jumped slightly, turning to see him standing a few feet away, his hands shoved into the pockets of his jeans. He looked casual but hesitant, his posture uncertain. "You startled me," she said, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I didn't hear you come out." "Sorry," Caleb said, giving her a sheepish smile. "I saw you out here and thought maybe you could use an extra pair of hands." Margaret hesitated. "I'm not sure how much help you'd be. Do you even know anything about gardening?" "Not a thing," he admitted, his smile widening slightly. "But I'm willing to learn." She couldn't help but chuckle, shaking her head. "All right, but don't say I didn't warn you. These hedges are a nightmare." Caleb stepped closer, taking the shears from her hands. As their fingers brushed, Margaret felt a jolt, her heart skipping a beat. She quickly pulled her hands back, pretending to adjust her gloves. "Here," she said, her voice a little too brisk. "Just trim the top edges. Nothing fancy." Caleb nodded, his movements careful as he began working on the hedge. Margaret stood beside him, pulling weeds from the flower bed and trying to focus on anything but the fact that he was so close. For a while, they worked in silence, the only sounds coming from the soft rustling of leaves and the occasional chirp of a bird. But the quiet wasn't the peaceful kind Margaret had hoped for. It was thick with unspoken words, a tension she couldn't ignore. "So," Caleb said suddenly, breaking the silence. "You've been avoiding me today." Margaret froze, her hands stilling in the dirt. "I'm not avoiding you," she said quickly, too quickly. He glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "It feels like you are." "I've just been busy," Margaret said, forcing a smile as she stood and brushed off her gloves. "There's a lot to get done around here." Caleb set the shears down, turning to face her fully. "You don't have to avoid me," he said softly, his eyes meeting hers. "About this morning. I don't want things to be weird between us." Margaret's breath caught. "It's not weird," she said, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. "It's just complicated," he finished for her. She nodded, her throat tightening. "Yes. Complicated." Caleb took a step closer, his gaze steady. "It doesn't have to be." Margaret took a step back instinctively, her heart racing. "Caleb, whatever this is, it's not right." "I know," he said quickly, his voice firm but not harsh. "I know it's not. But that doesn't change the fact that it's there." Margaret didn't respond. She couldn't. The intensity in his eyes was too much, too raw, and she didn't trust herself to speak. She turned away, pretending to inspect the hedge as she tried to steady her breathing. "I should probably get back to work," she said after a long moment, her voice tight. "There's still a lot to do." Caleb hesitated, and for a moment, she thought he might say something else. But then he nodded, picking up the shears again. "Yeah, sure." They worked in silence for the rest of the afternoon, but the air between them felt heavier than ever. Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that the ground beneath her was shifting, that something irreversible was unfolding. And no matter how hard she tried to convince herself otherwise, she knew deep down that this was far from over. By evening, the house had grown quiet. David had called earlier to say he would be staying an extra day on his business trip, leaving Margaret and Caleb alone once again. She had hoped the added day would allow the tension between them to dissipate, but instead, it seemed to grow heavier with each passing hour. Margaret busied herself in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for a light dinner. The rhythmic motion of the knife against the cutting board provided a temporary distraction, but her mind wandered relentlessly to the events of the day. Caleb's words in the garden echoed in her thoughts. "It doesn't have to be complicated." But it was. It was complicated in ways she couldn't untangle. The sound of Caleb's footsteps entering the kitchen jolted her from her thoughts. She glanced up to see him leaning casually against the doorframe, his hair slightly damp from a shower. He had changed into a simple t-shirt and sweatpants, his posture relaxed but his expression unreadable. "Smells good," he said, nodding toward the stove. "Just something simple," Margaret replied, keeping her tone neutral. She focused on stirring the soup, her back turned to him. "You've been avoiding me again," Caleb said, his voice calm but direct. Margaret stiffened, her grip tightening on the spoon. "I haven't been avoiding you," she said, though the words felt like a lie even to her. Caleb stepped closer, his presence filling the small kitchen. "You have," he insisted gently. "And I get it. But we can't keep pretending like nothing's going on." Margaret turned to face him, her heart pounding. "Caleb, I don't know what you're talking about," she said, though her voice trembled slightly. He leaned against the counter, his gaze steady and unflinching. "You know exactly what I'm talking about," he said softly. Whatever this is between us. It's real, Margaret. You can't deny that." Her breath caught, and she felt the air leave her lungs in a rush. "Caleb, stop," she said, her voice firm but shaky. "We can't, this isn't right." "I know it's not," he said quickly, his tone earnest. "I know how it looks, and I know how it feels. But that doesn't make it any less real." Margaret shook her head, turning back to the stove as if the simple act of stirring the soup could ground her. "You don't understand," she whispered. "This would ruin everything." "Would it?" he asked, his voice quieter now. "Or are you just scared to admit what you're feeling?" Margaret froze, her hand gripping the edge of the counter. "This isn't about feelings," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is about boundaries. About doing the right thing." Caleb stepped closer, and Margaret felt the heat of his presence behind her. "I'm not trying to hurt you," he said softly. "Or make your life more complicated. But I can't just ignore this anymore." "Can you?" Margaret turned to face him, her eyes searching his. The raw vulnerability in his expression made her chest tighten. "Caleb," she said, her voice trembling. "This has to stop. Whatever this is, it ends now." He didn't move. For a long moment, they stood there, the tension between them thick and suffocating. Margaret felt her pulse race as his eyes flicked to her lips, and she realized just how close they were standing. "I'm sorry," Caleb said finally, his voice low. "But I don't think I can." Before she could respond, the timer on the oven beeped loudly, breaking the moment like a shattering glass. Margaret turned away quickly, her hands trembling as she reached for the oven mitts. "Dinner's ready," she said, her voice clipped and controlled. Caleb lingered for a moment longer, then nodded and stepped back. "I'll set the table," he said, his tone neutral. The rest of the evening passed in silence. They ate at opposite ends of the table, the clinking of silverware against plates the only sound. Margaret couldn't bring herself to meet Caleb's gaze, and he didn't push her to. When the meal was over, Margaret busied herself with the dishes, grateful for the distraction. Caleb disappeared into his room without another word, leaving her alone with the weight of what had almost happened. As she climbed into bed later that night, Margaret felt an overwhelming sense of guilt and confusion. She had always thought of herself as a strong, principled woman, someone who would never let her emotions get the better of her. But tonight, she had come dangerously close to crossing a line she couldn't uncross. And the worst part was, she wasn't sure if she regretted it. The following morning dawned gray and overcast, the sky heavy with the promise of rain. Margaret woke early, her body exhausted but her mind restless. She had barely slept, her thoughts consumed by the tension with Caleb and the weight of what they'd nearly crossed the night before. As she sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the pale light filtering through the curtains, she knew she had to address the situation, no matter how difficult it would be. The sound of soft footsteps on the stairs signaled Caleb's descent. Margaret hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. For a moment, she considered staying in her room, waiting until he left the house to avoid the inevitable conversation. But she dismissed the thought as cowardly. Whatever this was, it had to end today. Margaret found Caleb in the kitchen, sipping coffee and staring out the window at the dreary sky. He turned when she entered, his expression unreadable. She noticed the faint shadows under his eyes, as though he, too, had spent the night lost in thought. "Good morning," he said softly, his voice cautious. "Morning," Margaret replied, her tone strained. She busied herself with pouring a cup of tea, her movements deliberate and slow. She needed the time to gather her thoughts. An awkward silence settled between them as they sipped their respective drinks, neither daring to broach the subject that lingered like a storm cloud overhead. Finally, Margaret set her cup down, the ceramic clinking against the table louder than she intended. "Caleb," she began, her voice firm but trembling slightly. "We need to talk." He nodded, setting his coffee aside. "I know." Margaret took a deep breath, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "What happened yesterday? What's been happening between us? It has to stop. This can't go on." Caleb leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. "I know it's wrong," he said, his voice low and earnest. "But that doesn't make it any easier to ignore." "We don't have a choice," Margaret said quickly, cutting him off. "It doesn't matter how we feel or what we think might happen. The fact is, this isn't right. For either of us." Her words hung in the air, heavy with finality. Caleb looked at her, his expression pained but resigned. "I never meant to make things harder for you," he said softly. "I care about you, Margaret. More than I should. But I don't want to hurt you." Margaret's heart ached at the vulnerability in his voice, but she forced herself to stay resolute. "You haven't hurt me," she said, though she wasn't entirely sure it was true. "But if we keep going down this path, we'll both end up regretting it. We have to stop now, before it's too late." Caleb nodded slowly, his shoulders slumping as though the weight of her words had finally settled on him. "You're right," he said quietly. I don't know how to pretend this didn't happen." "Neither do I," Margaret admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But we have to try. For both our sakes." For a long moment, they sat in silence, the rain beginning to patter against the windows. The soft rhythm of the drops filled the space between them, soothing in its simplicity. Margaret felt a strange sense of relief, as though the storm that had been building for days was finally breaking. "I think I should leave," Caleb said suddenly, his voice steady but tinged with sadness. "For a while, at least. Maybe it'll give us both some space to figure things out." Margaret's stomach twisted at the thought of him leaving, but she knew he was right. "Maybe that's for the best," she said reluctantly. Caleb stood, pushing his chair back with a soft scrape. He hesitated for a moment, then looked down at her with an expression that was both tender and bittersweet. I hope one day we can look back on this and understand it better. That it'll make sense somehow." Margaret gave him a faint smile, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Maybe." He nodded, then turned and left the room. Margaret listened to the sound of his footsteps retreating, followed by the soft click of the front door closing behind him. She sat there for a long time, staring at the empty space where he had been. The next few days passed in a blur. Caleb packed his belongings and left without fanfare, his departure marked only by a quiet goodbye and a brief hug at the door. Margaret watched him drive away, her chest heavy with a mix of relief and sorrow. David returned from his trip that evening, his usual cheerful demeanor a stark contrast to the turmoil Margaret felt inside. She plastered on a smile, going through the motions of being the dutiful wife, but her heart wasn't in it. The house felt emptier without Caleb's presence, and she couldn't help but notice the void he had left behind. Months passed, and life slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy. Margaret focused on her work, her friends, and her marriage, trying to rebuild the life she had before Caleb's return. But every so often, she would find herself thinking of him, his laughter, his quiet strength, the way he had looked at her in those fleeting moments of connection. One evening, as she was sorting through a drawer, Margaret came across a folded piece of paper. She opened it carefully, her breath catching as she recognized Caleb's handwriting. "Margaret. I'm sorry for everything. I never meant to make your life more complicated. You mean more to me than I can explain, but I know this isn't right. I hope you find the happiness you deserve. Take care of yourself." She traced the words with her fingertips, her chest tightening. For a moment, she allowed herself to feel the ache of his absence, the weight of what could never be. Then she folded the note and tucked it back into the drawer, taking a deep breath. Margaret didn't know if she would ever fully move on from what had happened, but she knew one thing for certain: she had to try. The line they had almost crossed would remain, a boundary that could never be erased. But perhaps, in time, it would also serve as a reminder, a lesson in the complexity of human emotions and the strength it took to do the right thing, even when it hurt. And with that thought, Margaret turned off the